Welcome to Finance Trice, the world's modern broadcast hub for all things finance. From investing strategies to economic updates, from crypto insights to real world money lessons, every broadcast is designed to help you think smarter, plan wiser, and grow.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking a really fascinating turn. We aren't dissecting a specific market trend or, a new piece of regulation. Instead, we are diving into source material that acts as the absolute blueprint for how effective high-stakes information is designed and delivered. And this isn't something that was ever written for the public. It really reads like a master script, maybe extracted from private training modules, the kind used by top-tier financial institutions and educators. Our mission today for you, the learner, is to understand the metagame. We are going beneath the surface of the message itself, whether it's about investment strategy, tax avoidance, or generational wealth transfer, to understand how the structural architecture dictates retention, critical thinking, and most importantly, application. If you want to know how powerful, influential narratives are built to teach people how the wealthy think about money that schools never teach, well, this document is your guide.
That framing is so important. We really are analyzing the architecture of influence and understanding, and specifically in the context of sophisticated financial intelligence. The way these concepts are communicated within wealthy circles is often radically different from what you see in general public education. It's a move away from simple, dry data presentation, which, let's be honest, just fails when the stakes are high, to a more strategic, psychologically optimized way of telling a story. We're looking at why structure is power.
Okay, let's unpack this blueprint then. I want to start with something that on the surface should seem completely counterintuitive to serious financial analysis, and that's the need for immediate, almost cinematic engagement. The very first elements listed here are the foundation of capturing and keeping attention: a cold open hook, strong storytelling, and visual and cinematic references. So my first question is, why? In a world of high-stakes financial strategy, why do we need the communication to feel like a blockbuster movie trailer? Doesn't relying on, cinematic flair or emotional hooks, doesn't that cheapen the content?
That's a great challenge. And it's a very common assumption, right? That high-level analysis should be purely intellectual, objective, devoid of any flair.
Yeah.
But that assumption completely ignores human psychology. This blueprint, it understands that attention is the most valuable commodity in the world right now. If you are trying to communicate incredibly complex, demanding ideas, let's say the intricacies of derivative markets, you are competing against every single social media notification, every quick dopamine hit. The cold open hook is absolutely critical because it forces an immediate cognitive buy-in. It doesn't start with background. It doesn't start with definitions. It starts with the high-stakes consequence.
Okay, so instead of opening with Chapter 1, an overview of asset allocation.
Right, boring.
It starts with something like the 3 minutes that decided whether this $100 million portfolio survived the 2008 crash.
Exactly. It completely bypasses the inertia of traditional learning, and that leads right into the strong storytelling component. This is what translates abstract ideas like risk and reward into something tangible, something human. The story isn't about how to calculate a beta coefficient. The story is about the two partners who started with the same capital. One followed the strategy and built multi-generational success, and the other was paralyzed by fear, didn't have the foundational understanding, and lost half his assets in a single panic sell-off.
It grounds the abstract in consequence and in character.
Precisely. It
Okay.
gives the information stakes.
I can see the immediate link to memorability there. I mean, you remember stories, not spreadsheets. And when we talk about visual and cinematic references, this is where the blueprint really pushes the boundaries, I think. How do you even begin to translate something as mind-numbingly complex as a leveraged buyout or a complex trust structure into a single memorable cinematic analogy?
You leverage shared cultural knowledge. It's brilliant, really. It creates an instant cognitive shortcut. So when we say this is the Ocean's 11 approach to managing diversified risk, you don't need a 20-page document to get the gist.
No, you immediately grasp it. Complexity, coordination, high-stakes maneuvering, a team of specialists.
Exactly. Or let's say you need to explain the principle of moral hazard. You could reference that moment in a classic movie where a character acts recklessly because they know someone else, the insurance company, the government, will absorb the cost of their failure.
That mental image saves an incredible amount of time.
And it creates an emotional anchor, doesn't it?
It does. And it also signals something else. It signals that this information is important, it's sophisticated, and it's worth high production quality.
Which is then reinforced by the next point here. The requirement for professional voiceover flow and high-quality dialogue and sound details. So the delivery itself has to match the rigor of the content. Absolutely. Think about it. The first goal of this blueprint is to create an experience of high value. If the delivery is amateurish, if it sounds cheap, the underlying strategy, no matter how brilliant, is immediately devalued in the learner's mind. So this emotional ignition, this cinematic hook, it's all about preparing the ground for the really intensive intellectual work that's about to follow.
Okay, so we've hooked their attention. Now we have to move into bridging that pure logic with meaningful retention. This is where the blueprint insists on emotional engagement. It's not enough to be accurate. Why is connecting emotionally so essential for transferring high-level financial intelligence?
Because the decisions surrounding wealth are, at their core, inherently high-anxiety decisions. They just are. They're driven by these incredibly deep-seated fears, the fear of loss, the fear of poverty, or on the other side, the desire for ultimate security and freedom. If the educational material only engages the rational part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, then the minute a market stressor or a personal crisis hits,
The emotional brain takes over.
the limbic system takes over, exactly.
Yeah.
And all that rational thought is just abandoned. Panic sets in.
So what you're saying is the learning has to be wired deeper than just the analytical center of the brain. The emotional engagement ensures that the lesson is linked to a compelling emotional outcome, whether that's freedom or security or legacy.
Yep.
It provides this motivational staying power for when uncertainty inevitably arises.
Precisely. And this leads directly into the strategic use of the audience engagement prompt and open questions.
Yeah.
The blueprint isn't a passive document. It's designed to be a dialogue, even if it's an asynchronous one.
That's a huge shift in the power dynamic. It forces you, the learner, out of passive consumption.
Right. Instead of just stating a fact like diversification mitigates risk, the prompt asks something much more pointed. It asks, what concentration risks are you currently ignoring in your own financial structure that could lead to catastrophe in the next 12 months?
Wow.
You see, it forces immediate self-reflection and application. It reinforces the blueprint's goal of problem-solving educational guidance. The source isn't just dispensing facts, it's demanding personal transformation.
But before we even think about offering solutions or tools, the structure demands a very clear problem definition and context. If the listener is already hooked and engaged, why dedicate so much time to defining the problem all over again?
This is critical for establishing what I'd call the intellectual terrain. If you don't clearly articulate the scope and the severity of the problem, the solution just feels like superfluous information. It doesn't have any weight. This is the so what factor, but amplified. You have to first define why your current, often traditional approach is insufficient or maybe even actively dangerous in the modern climate.
So you establish the urgency. For instance, explaining why relying solely on conventional retirement structures is a massive generational problem, maybe because of systemic inflation or sovereign debt issues. You have to paint that picture first.
Exactly. And this problem is never, ever presented in isolation. The blueprint is very clear about this. It is always framed within the larger social and political context. I mean, high-level finance understands that the rules of the game tax codes, subsidies, the regulatory environment, all of that is set by governments and societal structures. Any deep dive that ignores that context is, frankly, incomplete and naive.
It sounds like it's demanding an understanding of the system, a system that often benefits from the listener remaining uninformed.
That's a big part of it. The communication has to justify its own existence by establishing a genuine intellectual crisis.
Yeah.
If you don't feel the weight of the problem, the structural flaw in your current mindset, then the solution is just noise.
And that necessity for justification leads directly into building unshakable credibility. To even begin discussing solutions to massive systemic problems, you need an investigative documentary tone.
Yes.
Let's talk about that tone. What's that sound like? It needs to be authoritative, but not arrogant.
It signals rigor. It sounds like you've spent months verifying every single piece of information. It implies multi-source verification, objectivity. It elevates the information above mere opinion or, casual commentary. It gives it the weight of an expose, as if you're uncovering verified truths that the conventional system is actively trying to hide.
And that tone has to be backed up.
It's substantiated by the absolute necessity of providing real data and references. And in some cases, even mentioning real footage evidence mention or citing expert opinions and citations.
So you're grounding every single argument in verifiable evidence. This contrasts so sharply with the kind of anecdotal trust me, bro, advice that you see proliferating online.
It's the opposite of that. This lending of intellectual weight is completely non-negotiable for high-impact communication that deals with large sums of money.
And all this rigor, this evidence, must be used to clear the cognitive slate.
Yes.
The structural element of myth-busting and misconceptions is one of the most powerful tools in this entire blueprint.
It really is.
So why? Why is actively dismantling old, incorrect knowledge stuff people might have believed their entire lives so crucial before you introduce the new structured knowledge? Why not just introduce the new truth?
Because the brain is incredibly reluctant to accept new data that conflicts with deeply held beliefs, even if those beliefs are damaging. There's a name for this phenomenon. It's called cognitive dissonance. You have to address the existing assumptions head on. If you don't dismantle the myth, say the myth that high liquidity savings accounts are the safest way to build wealth, the learner will continually try to reconcile the new complex truth with the old simple lie, and they'll fail.
So myth-busting creates a kind of controlled crisis of confidence. You clear away the prior incorrect belief, and that leaves a cognitive void.
And the brain, which just hates unresolved tension, becomes highly receptive to the new structured knowledge you're about to implant. It's structural preparation. You're moving from debunking what schools taught you to implanting the necessary foundational mindset for wealth.
So just to summarize section 1, it's all about ignition, urgency, and trust. We've hooked the heart, we've defined the urgency through context, and we've established unwavering trust through investigative rigor.
Correct. We have their attention, and they believe we possess the authoritative truth. Now we face the challenge of managing the incredible complexity of time and sequence.
Right. This is where we transition from context into complexity. The blueprint puts a huge emphasis on a chronological narrative timeline flow. Why is that sequential structure so essential for understanding sophisticated financial concepts? Concepts that often operate across decades when most of us are trained to think in terms of, quarterly returns.
Because true wealth building, unlike speculation, is a long game. It's defined by the dynamic relationship between cause and effect over time. A chronological narrative allows for the logical development of those ideas. Think about the difference between looking at a static balance sheet from last year versus following the dynamic journey of a particular asset. A piece of real estate, a private business, maybe a portfolio from its inception through multiple economic cycles.
It allows the learner to simulate the long-term impact of short-term decisions. You can actually see the difference between static data presentation and a dynamic narrative unfolding.
Exactly. And this structure, this timeline, allows us to use sophisticated literary devices like foreshadowing and callbacks. And no, these aren't just for novels. They are essential for managing cognitive load in complex analysis.
Okay, that's interesting. How are foreshadowing and callbacks integrated into strategic financial analysis without sounding gimmicky?
Well, foreshadowing builds intellectual suspense, and it manages how you introduce critical variables. For example, you might say, this complex tax structure is highly beneficial now, but we must foreshadow the regulatory cliff that awaits it in 2028. We'll detail the exit strategy for that in section 4. You see what that does? It forces the listener to dedicate cognitive energy to tracking that unresolved future variable. It boosts retention, and it proves that your analysis is comprehensive. You've thought it all the way through.
And the callbacks then reinforce the learning by connecting these disparate parts of the analysis. Something like, remember that behavioral error we identified back in section 1, loss aversion? Well, here is the exact moment that impulse led to a catastrophic decision for our case study subject 10 years down the timeline.
It creates a tightly woven tapestry of knowledge where every single piece of information reinforces all the others. This is absolutely essential for developing true, independent financial intelligence, which really requires synthesizing information across timelines.
That makes perfect sense. Now, this knowledge has to be grounded in reality, not just abstraction. The blueprint requires a realistic setting and location and even calls for cinematic scene descriptions. Again, why is providing a tangible physical and geographical framework so necessary for comprehension and successful simulation?
Because abstract market forces are just. They're impossible to truly internalize. But if you describe the strategy playing out in a tangible setting like, imagine the silence in the boardroom of the Federal Reserve during that emergency Sunday meeting, or see how this principle applies during a tense, multi-generational family negotiation over asset transfer at a ranch in Montana, it provides a powerful cognitive anchor.
So the learner can run mental simulations. If they can picture the scene, they internalize the feeling and the stakes of the decision, which ties right back to the emotional engagement we were talking about earlier.
Precisely. And that setting is never isolated. It's always impacted by the larger social and political context. We have to move beyond just the technical mechanics and acknowledge that financial strategy is played on a field that's defined by regulatory bodies, cultural norms, and governmental policies. The wealthy understand that the rules are malleable and often incredibly complex.
So an incomplete analysis of the context renders the information incomplete, or maybe even dangerous. A rule of thumb about an investment without understanding the political and regulatory environment that shaped it is a liability.
It's a huge liability, and this requires nuance, the inclusion of cultural and local relevance and global-local comparisons. Financial success is not universal. A strategy that involves, say, aggressive debt leveraging might be a brilliant move in an American market focused on maximizing tax deductions in personal enterprise.
But catastrophic in a highly regulated European or Asian market that prioritizes stability and corporate compliance.
Exactly. You have to compare these opposing approaches, the European compliance and regulatory strategy versus the more individualistic capital growth focus of the U.S. You have to recognize that generalized principles need to be tailored for maximum applicability.
It's the difference between receiving advice and receiving high-level intelligence.
And throughout this entire journey, the professional quality of the delivery, the professional tone and structured flow has to be maintained, ensuring that even though you're jumping between timelines and locations, the rigor remains absolutely intact. We're building a coherent, worldly view for you, the learner.
Okay, we've built the foundation and we've mapped the timeline. Now we fire up the real analytical engine of the Blueprint Section 3, where depth and precision are mandatory. We start with the core requirement of deep intelligence, cause and effect analysis. It's moving beyond just correlation to identifying the true mechanisms of action. This is really hard, particularly in complex systems like the global economy.
It is the defining feature of sophisticated thinking. Correlation is cheap, causation is expensive. The blueprint insists that the material must definitively explain why something happens, not just that it did happen. For example, why did the housing bubble burst? Simply saying subprime mortgages is just correlation. Cause and effect requires mapping the systemic mechanisms. The complex interplay between exotic mortgage derivatives, the failure of rating agencies to apply appropriate risk weighting, and the behavioral pressure on lenders to just increase volume at all costs.
And to dissect that, you require precision. This is addressed by the requirement for scientific technical explanations and the use of named theories and terms. We aren't afraid of technical terminology here, but we have to ensure those terms are immediately anchored.
Precision is rigor. We're introducing complexity, but we're managing it through crystal clear definitions. If we introduce concepts like moral hazard or Minsky moments or the efficient market hypothesis, we have to define those concepts immediately and robustly.
That's the medical technical terms defined part.
Right. And then you use that precise language consistently throughout the rest of the analysis. That intellectual rigor is what separates high-impact education from simplistic, surface-level summaries you can find anywhere.
So if we take moral hazard, for example, we're not just defining it as taking more risk. It's defined as the specific psychological tendency of one party to increase their exposure to risk because they know or believe that another party, the government, a large financial institution, and insurer will bear the cost of any negative consequences.
Exactly. But this precision, this technical analysis, it has to be humanized. It can't exist in a vacuum. The blueprint immediately reminds us of this by requiring behavioral examples, human stories and case studies, and even character backstory integration.
Why the intense focus on history and biography?
Because principles are abstract, but they stick when they are attached to people. Financial intelligence requires managing one's own psychology more than anything else. Abstract risk aversion suddenly becomes profoundly relevant when you explore the character backstory integration of a seemingly successful individual who had a fear-driven, unaddressed aversion to volatility that stemmed from a childhood experience of scarcity.
So case studies allow the learner to see these abstract principles enacted in the real world, including the inevitable mistakes and, critically, the emotional fallout from those mistakes.
It's applied psychology. You're integrating history to illustrate the analytical points, showing that even the most calculated strategies can falter when human behavior isn't properly accounted for.
And that leads us to the sophisticated analysis of viewpoints. High-level financial thinking is rarely about finding the single right answer. It's about optimizing an answer for a specific set of constraints. That requires comparisons and contrasts.
Yes. So we compare opposing strategies, growth investing versus value investing, or active management versus passive indexing.
And we don't declare one the victor. We highlight the strengths and weaknesses of each in different economic climates.
It reveals the nuance. But the most challenging element of all, really the pinnacle of the blueprint's intellectual demands, is multi-perspective storytelling.
This is where the communication has to avoid dogma entirely. So how do you present diverse, even conflicting viewpoints on a topic as divisive as, say, cryptocurrency or modern monetary theory, without just confusing the listener?
By establishing authority over the viewpoints, not within any single one of them. The communication presents viewpoint A, the bullish revolutionary argument, compellingly. Then it presents viewpoint B, the cautious historical counterargument with equal rigor and respect. The narrative doesn't resolve the conflict for you. It forces you, the learner, to synthesize the information critically. It requires you to weigh the evidence and the psychological drivers of both sides.
It's a huge difference. If you only present one view, you create followers. If you present 3 compelling, conflicting views, you create independent, critical thinkers. And that seems to be the ultimate goal of high-stakes intelligence.
And underpinning all of this is the requirement for psychology and emotional simulation. We have to anticipate and model human emotional responses to different scenarios, moving beyond pure financial logic into applied behavioral science.
Can you give me a specific example of how the blueprint structures an emotional simulation like that?
Sure. Think about the psychological principle of loss aversion. The finding that the pain of a loss is about twice as powerful as the pleasure of an equivalent gain. If you're describing a high-risk investment, the communication must not just show the potential return, it must simulate the feeling of panic and the behavioral error you will likely face when that investment is down 20% in 2 weeks.
It's preemptive behavioral training. It advises you to account for your own psychology via behavioral safety recommendations.
It's preparing you for the moment of maximum stress, arming you with a rational framework before your limbic brain takes over and tells you to sell everything.
And just to maintain engagement through all this complexity, the blueprint even calls for a twist-reveal suspense buildup. How on earth do you pull off a twist in a rigorous finance lesson?
It's often used to overturn a widely accepted but flawed assumption. The suspense builds as you lay out all the data supporting a traditional theory. Let's say the stock market is generally efficient. The twist reveal then uses proprietary data, or a little-known regulatory loophole, to demonstrate a systemic inefficiency that fundamentally changes the entire risk-reward calculation.
It's an intellectually satisfying moment.
And it serves as a powerful mnemonic device. It makes the core lesson completely unforgettable.
So Section 3 is really the synthesis factory. It's blending hard data, human behavior, and high-level analytical comparison. It's showing you what sophisticated thinking actually looks like in practice.
Exactly. And now we must ensure that all of this intellectual muscle leads somewhere practical and, importantly, responsible. We have to move toward application.
This is the final stage of the blueprint. It focuses on professional application and the necessary guardrails for high-stakes decisions. Let's start with formal rigor. The blueprint demands legal analysis and documentation and ethical and legal cautions. Why is this a mandatory component of communication about wealth?
Because high-level financial strategy, the kind that truly separates the informed from the uniformed, operates at this incredibly complex intersection of regulatory boundaries, tax codes, and legal liability. Any truly effective strategy involves leveraging existing legal frameworks. So whether the communication is about establishing a specific type of trust or exploiting an international tax treaty, showing you, the learner, that the content is aware of the formal legal constraints, well, it reinforces professionalism. And more importantly, it reduces the risk of you taking expensive, uninformed action.
So it's about delineating the difference between legal minimization and illegal evasion. It's not preachy, it's necessary risk management.
It is the ultimate form of due diligence. If you're discussing a complex strategy for, let's say, intergenerational wealth transfer, the document must include the legal constraints that govern that transfer. This is where the blueprint moves from theory to verifiable, real-world execution.
And this rigor has to be reflected in the delivery itself. The requirement for a professional delivery, including the professional voiceover flow and high-quality sound, isn't just an aesthetic preference, is it?
Not at all. It's a critical credibility booster. You are trusting this information with your most valuable assets, your money, your future, and potentially your freedom if you misuse the knowledge. A structured, clear, high-production quality delivery reinforces the authority of the analysis. It signals to your subconscious. This information has been carefully researched, verified, and packaged for high-value users.
We've talked about logic and emotion throughout this whole deep dive. Here, the blueprint calls for a strategic blend of emotional and illogical persuasion, or a logical and emotional balance. This is the final synthesis that's required, isn't it?
It's the critical balance that actually ensures action. The information has to be rigorously defensible and fact-based. That's the logical part, so it can withstand internal and external critique. But it also has to be powerfully motivating. It has to instill the confidence needed to overcome market fear. That's the emotional part. You need the logic to defend the strategy against critics and regulators, and you need the emotion to motivate yourself to actually execute the strategy when market volatility inevitably sets in.
Moving into the practicality component, the blueprint demands a conversion of all this high-level analysis into actionable guidance. It calls for practical tips and tools and details step-by-step journey process explanations. The focus shifts entirely from analysis to implementation here.
Because the world's best investment strategy is completely useless if you're paralyzed by the complexity of implementing it. We have to move you from abstract thought like, I understand the principles of structuring a family holding company, to concrete implementation. Here are the 3 specific tools or legal structures to research, and here are steps 1, 2, and 3 for initiating the conversation with your legal counsel.
That structured process explanation is key to ensuring the complexity doesn't result in paralysis. It provides a navigational map, and that fulfills the overarching goal of problem-solving educational guidance.
And that guidance has to be forward-looking. The inclusion of future vision and goal setting ensures the information isn't just historical or theoretical. It helps you establish tangible, motivating objectives. It answers the fundamental question, what does successful application of this mindset look like 6 months from now? A year from now, 10 years from now.
It paints a picture of the achieved state, and that reinforces the emotional motivation to execute all the detailed steps. This section really closes the loop, converting sophisticated theory into rigorous, ethical, and practical action.
It ensures that the knowledge isn't merely acquired, it's activated. Yet we've covered an extraordinary amount of ground today, analyzing the architecture of influence that's embedded in this master blueprint. It's become incredibly clear that communicating high-level financial intelligence requires far, far more than just accurate data. We saw 3 major interconnected areas that define effective knowledge transfer for the wealthy. First, the absolute necessity of the emotional hook and context setting. Using those cinematic analogies, strong human storytelling, and rigorous problem definition to establish immediate relevance and unshakable credibility. It just overcomes the inertia of traditional learning. Second, the rigor of multi-perspective analysis. It demands cause and effect thinking, precision through defined technical terms, and the sophistication to force you, the learner, to synthesize conflicting viewpoints and anticipate your own behavioral failures. And then finally, the crucial conversion of theory into ethical practical action, ensuring the information is balanced between logic and emotion, accompanied by step-by-step tools for implementation, and all of it framed with the necessary ethical and legal guardrails to ensure safety and integrity.
What really stands out to me is the central lesson here. The true insight isn't in what the information is, the actual financial advice, but in the sophisticated psychological structure that's used to present and internalize those points. The professionals who build this kind of communication, they understand that effective learning is a designed system. It uses literary devices, psychological modeling, and investigative rigor to ensure 100% absorption and application. They aren't just teaching you facts, they are wiring a new financial mindset into you. So we have a challenge for you, the learner. You now possess this meta-knowledge. We want you to apply this blueprint to the information you consume this week. Pick a difficult, high-space document or a strategic report you need to digest. And don't just read the content, analyze its structure. Did it start with a high-stakes cold open hook? Did it use a callback to reinforce a prior lesson? How did it handle multi-perspective storytelling?
And ask yourself, how does analyzing the structure of the information you consume change its meaning for you? It forces you to look at the process of persuasion, not just the facts being presented.
Exactly. And a final thought, if all effective, high-impact communication follows this master blueprint, who are the invisible architects shaping the narratives you consume every day? The ones influencing your financial, your political, and your strategic decisions. By recognizing these structural components, you move from being a passive recipient of information to an active, intellectually empowered decision maker.
The true power lies in understanding the process.
Thank you for joining us on The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.